Having got this woman done, he brought her to the man, and they started housekeeping. And a few minutes afterwards, a snake came through a crack in the fence and commenced to talk with her on the subject of fruit. She was not acquainted with the neighborhood, and she did not know whether snakes talked or not, or whether they knew anything about apples or not. Well, she was misled, and her husband ate some of those apples and laid it all on his wife. God ought to have rubbed him out at once. He might have known that no good could come of starting a world with a man like that. They were turned out. Then trouble commenced, and people got worse and worse. God, you must recollect, was holding the reins of government, but he did nothing for them. He allowed them to live 669 years without knowing their ABCs. He never started a school, not even a Sunday school. He didn't even keep his own boys at home. And the world got worse and worse every day. And finally, he concluded to drown them. Yet the same God has the impudence to tell me how to raise my own children. What would you think of a neighbor who had just killed his babes giving you his views on domestic economy? God found that he could do nothing with them, and he said, I'll drown them all, except a few. And he picked out a fellow by the name of Noah, who had been a bachelor for 500 years. If I had to drown anybody, I would have drowned him. I believe Noah had been married something like 100 years. God told him to build a boat, and he built one 500 feet long, 80 or 90 feet broad, and 55 feet high, with one door shunted on the outside and one window 22 inches square. If Noah had a hobby in the world, it was ventilation. Then into this ark he put certain numbers of all the animals of the world. Naturalists have ascertained that at the time there were at least 1,100,000 insects necessary to go into the ark, about 40,000 mammalia, about 1,600 reptilia, to say nothing of the mastodon, the elephant, and the animalcula, of which thousands live upon a single leaf, and which cannot be seen by the naked eye. Noah had no microscope, and yet he had to pick them out by pairs. You have no idea the trouble that man had. Some say that the flood was not universal, that it was partial. Why then did God say, I will destroy everything beneath the heavens? If it was partial, why did Noah save the birds? An ordinary bird, strictly tending to business, can beat a partial flood. Why did he put the birds in there? The eagles, the vultures, the condors, if it was only a partial flood. And how did he get them in there? Were they inspired to go there, or did he drive them up? Did the polar bear leave his home in the ice to start for the tropics, inquiring for Noah? And could a kangaroo come from Australia unless he was inspired or somebody was behind him? Then there are animals on this hemisphere, not on that. How did he get them across? And there are some animals which would be very unpleasant in an ark unless the ventilation was very perfect. When he got the animals in the ark, God shut the door, and Noah pulled down the window. And it began to rain, and went on raining until the water went 29 feet over the highest mountain. Chimborazo then as now lifted its head above the clouds. And yet the waters rose and rose over every mountain in the world. 29 feet above the highest peaks covered with snow and ice. How deep were these waters? 5.5 miles. How long did it rain? 40 days. How much did it have to rain? About 800 feet. How's that for dampness? No wonder they said the windows of heaven were open. If I had been there, I would have said the whole side of the house was out. How long were they in this ark? 1 year and 10 days, floating around with no rudder, no sail, nobody on the outside at all. The window was shut and there was no door except the one that was on the outside. Who ran the ark? Who took care of it? And finally it came down on Mount Ararat, a peak 7,000 feet above the level of the sea, with about 3,000 feet of snow, and it stopped there simply to give the animals from the tropics a chance. Then Noah opened the window and got a breath of fresh air, and let out all the animals. And then Noah took a drink, and God made a bargain with him, that he would not drown us any more, and he put a rainbow in the clouds, and said, When I see that, I will recollect that I promised not to drown you. Because if it was not for that, he's apt to drown us at any moment. Now who can believe that this is the origin of the rainbow? Are you not all familiar with the natural causes which bring those beautiful arches to our eyes? Then the people started out again, and they were as bad as before. Here let me ask why God did not make Noah in the first place. He knew that he would have to drown Adam and Eve and all his family. Then another thing. Why did he want to drown the animals? What had they done? What crime had they committed? It's very hard to answer these questions. That is for a man who's only been born once. After a while they tried to build a tower to get into heaven, and the gods heard about it and said, Let us go down and see what man is up to. They came down and found things a great deal worse than they had thought. Thereupon they confounded the language to prevent them from succeeding, so that the fellow up above could not shout down, Mortar, or brick, to the one below. and they had to give it up. Now, is it possible anybody believes that that is the reason why we have a variety of languages in the world? Do you know that language is born of human experience and is a physical science? Do you know that every word has been suggested in some way by the feelings or observation of man? That there are words as tender as dawn, as serene as the stars, and others as wild as beasts? Do you know that language is dying and being born continually? That every language has its cemetery and cradle, its bud and blossom and withered leaf? Man has loved, enjoyed, and suffered, and language is simply the expression he gives to those experiences. Then the world began to divide, and the Jewish nation was started. Now I want to say that at one time your ancestors were like mine, were barbarians. If the Jewish people had to write these books now, they would be civilized books, and I do not hold them responsible for what their ancestors did. We find the Jewish people first in Canaan, and there were about 70 of them, counting Joseph and his children already in Egypt. They lived 215 years, and they went down into Egypt and stayed there 215 years. They were 430 years in Canaan and Egypt. How many did they have when they went to Egypt? 70. How many at the end of 215 years? 3 million. That's a good many. We had at the time of revolution in this country 3 million people. Since then there have been 4 doubles, until we have 48 millions today. How many would the Jews number at the same ratio in 215 years? Call it 8 doubles, and we have nearly 40,000. Instead of 40,000, they have 3 million. How do I know they had 3 million? Because they had 600,000 men of war. For every honest voter in the state of Illinois, there will be 5 other people, and there will always be more voters than men of war. They must have had, at the lowest possible estimate, 3 millions of people. Is that true? Is there a minister in the city of Chicago that was certified to his own idiocy by claiming that they could have increased to 3 millions by that time? If there is, let him say so. Do not let him talk about the civilizing influence of a lie. When they got into the desert, they took a census to see how many firstborn children there were. They found they had 22,273 firstborn males. It is reasonable to suppose there was about the same number of firstborn girls, or 45,000 firstborn children. There must have been as many mothers as firstborn children. Divide 3 millions by 45,000 mothers, and you will find that the women in Israel had to have on average 68 children apiece. Some stories are too thin. This is too thick. Now, we know among 3 million people, there will be about 300 births a day. And according to the Old Testament, whenever a child was born, the mother had to make a sacrifice, a sin offering for the crime of having been a mother. If there's anything in this universe that is infinitely pure, it is a mother with her child in her arms. Every woman had to sacrifice a couple of doves, a couple of pigeons, and the priest had to cook and eat those pigeons in the most holy place. At that time, there were at least 300 births per day, and the priest had to cook and eat those pigeons in the most holy place. At that time, there were only 3 priests, 200 birds apiece per day. I look on them as the champion bird eaters of the world. Then where were these Jews? They were upon the desert of Sinai, and the Sahara compared to that is a garden. Imagine an ocean of lava, torn by storm and vexed by tempest, suddenly gazed at by Gorgon and changed to stone. Such was the desert of Sinai. The whole supplies of the world could not maintain 3 millions of people in the desert of Sinai for 40 years. It would have cost 100,000s of millions of dollars, and would have bankrupt Christendom. Yet there they were with flocks and herds, so many that they sacrificed 150,000 firstborn lambs at one time. It would require millions of acres to support those flocks, and yet there was no blade of grass. There was no account of it raining baled hay. They sacrificed 150,000 lambs, and the blood had to be sprinkled on the altar within 2 hours, and there were only 3 priests. They would have to sprinkle the blood of 1,250 lambs per minute. Then all the people gathered in front of the tabernacle 18 feet deep. 3 millions of people would make a column 6 miles long. Some reverend gentlemen say 90 feet deep. Well, that would make a column of over a mile. Where were all these people going? They were going to the Holy Land. How large was it? 12,000 square miles, 1/5 the size of Illinois. A frightful country covered with rocks and desolation. There never was a land agent in the city of Chicago that would not have blushed with shame to have described that land as flowing with milk and honey. Do you believe that Almighty God ever went into partnership with hornets? Is it necessary to salvation? God said to the Jews, I will send hornets before you to drive out the Canaanites. How would a hornet know a Canaanite? Is it possible that God inspired the hornets? That he granted letters of marque and reprisal to hornets?